So welcome to this explainer. We're going to jump right in today with a pretty big question. Is a classroom always a neutral place of learning, or could it actually be used as a deliberate ideological tool? Keep that in the back of your mind as we get into this.
Today, we are diving into a really fascinating critical analysis of the Kenyan education system. We're going to unpack the deep-rooted historical traps that were literally built into the classrooms, and on the flip side, the incredibly vibrant grassroots movements that are fighting back today. It's a look at how knowledge is structured, who it actually serves, and honestly, why understanding this might completely change how you view your own education.
To make sense of all this, we'll be exploring education as both a cage of control and a key to liberation. We're going to cover 6 main areas today. 1. The imperial blueprint. 2. The illusion of reform. 3. The neoliberal funding trap. 4. The linguistic hierarchy. 5. Grassroots educational resistance. And finally, 6. A decolonized future. Let's get started.
Section 1. The Imperial Blueprint.
Okay, so look at this breakdown. Between 1895 and 1963, the colonial era relied on this very intentional, rigid racial stratification. It was basically a caste system. The European track? Fully state-funded, focusing on rigorous humanities to essentially reproduce the ruling elite. Then you had the Asian track, which was moderately subsidized to create a sort of middle-class intermediary layer. But the African track? The funding was absolutely abysmal. They relied almost entirely on missionaries, and the curriculum was strictly confined to minimal literacy and manual labor. They were intentionally weaponizing resources to maintain a very specific socioeconomic hierarchy.
And the discrimination went even deeper than that. Within that African track, men were taught what they called the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, basically just enough to handle low-level clerical work. But African women? They were restricted to the 3 B's: broom, bathing, and babies. No, really. That wasn't an accident. It was a foundational inequality explicitly designed to lock women into domesticity, and it set up these massive disparities that lasted long after the colonial era ended.
If you want to understand the mindset of the time, just look at Carey Francis. He was a hugely influential headmaster back then, and he actively opposed mass education for Africans. He literally compared it to casting pearls before swine. His entire goal was to ration out literary education to just a tiny, hand-picked elite, who could then manage the masses for the British Crown. The whole system was built on blind obedience, not critical thinking.
Moving on to Section 2. The Illusion of Reform.
So, fast forward to independence in 1963. The newly established state has this monumental task of rebuilding. But scholars point out that post-colonial leaders suffered from what's called a caged colonial mentality, meaning they had deeply internalized the exact intellectual habits and cultural hierarchies of their colonizers. So they updated the educational user interface by removing overt racial segregation. But, and this is key, they accidentally left the colonial operating system completely intact. They preserved the old academic barriers because, well, it protected their own newly acquired privileges.
You can actually track this illusion of reform over the decades. In 1964, the Amindia Commission abolishes segregation. Great, but cements English dominance. Then the 1981 Mackay Report creates the 844 system, which aimed for vocational self-reliance, but it just deteriorated into highly competitive rote exam drilling. Right up to the 2017 competency-based curriculum. Every single reform promised decolonization, but ultimately, they just reproduce the exact same neo-colonial class divisions.
Section 3. The Neoliberal Funding Trap. You really can't talk about educational structure without talking about money, right? After a golden era of high state subsidies right after independence, things shifted dramatically in the late 80s. Structural adjustment programs mandated by the World Bank and IMF forced a cost-sharing model. This completely froze subsidies and shifted the massive financial burden directly onto households. Which brings us to today's means-tested loans that treat education as a private commodity rather than a public good.
And the fallout from that financial shift is profound. Chronic underfunding literally strips universities of their intellectual autonomy. Think about it. When the state starves public universities of cash, they become highly dependent on foreign donors just to survive. And those donors get to dictate the research metrics, ensuring these institutions align with Western neoliberal priorities, instead of actually doing the work of deconstructing colonial knowledge hierarchies.
Section 4. The linguistic hierarchy.
Beyond the money, there are deep-rooted linguistic structures acting as massive barriers. In this system, English and Kiswahili are positioned as the superior, heavily resourced languages of science, diplomacy, and upward mobility. Meanwhile, Kenya's over 70 indigenous languages are inconsistently implemented, flat-out barred from national exams, and culturally treated as if they're scientifically deficient. By enforcing English as the ultimate gatekeeper, the system structurally advantages the elite while completely shutting out marginalized youth.
The source research argues that this deeply naturalized linguistic imperialism inflicts actual cognitive and cultural violence. I mean, imagine trying to grasp complex scientific concepts while simultaneously translating them in your head from a language completely alienated from your immediate reality and local ecosystem. The immense knowledge already embedded within indigenous languages is systematically invalidated and, tragically, lost.
Section 5. Grassroots Educational Resistance.
But here is where the story pivots, and it's super interesting. Despite all these formidable structural and linguistic barriers, the pushback is happening, starting with prominent intellectuals. Critical scholars like Dr. Wandi Njoya argue that modern donor-driven reforms, like the competency-based curriculum, aren't progressive at all. In fact, she frankly calls it an apartheid 2.0 system. By funneling marginalized kids into narrow vocational tracks and subordinating the liberal arts to STEM, she argues these policies are actively undereducating African children just to standardize a cheap labor force.
And this intellectual critique is sparking real action on the ground through something scholars call fugitive pedagogy. It's essentially the revolutionary act of disengaging from state structures to create community-centered spaces. A perfect example is the Community University of Social Work in Nairobi. They realized that state-sanctioned social work was entirely based on Western individualistic models that totally ignored historical injustices. So they just created an alternative space. They trained social workers using a decolonized curriculum grounded in Ubuntu ethics and community-based care networks. It's brilliant.
Another awesome example is Utamaduni Bora. It's a culturally grounded, open educational resource aimed at early childhood. By bringing traditional Kikuyu folktales, ancestral wisdom, and indigenous language activities directly into the classroom, projects like this serve as powerful decolonial tools. They are actively resisting colonial erasure by making indigenous knowledge a free, completely legitimate pedagogical resource for the youngest learners.
And finally, Section 6, a decolonized future.
So how do we actually break the cage? Well, the research outlines 5 essential transformations. We need epistemological reconstruction, which means we can't just tokenize local languages. We have to actually integrate indigenous knowledge across all sciences and arts. We need a liberating pedagogy that finally replaces rote memorization with inquiry-based learning. We need linguistic decolonization to truly resource mother tongue literacy. And crucially, we absolutely need financial autonomy and academic freedom to escape that donor dependency and foster real democratic dialogue.
And here's a crucial nuance to all of this. Progressive African classicists argue that true emancipation doesn't mean rejecting all Western knowledge and retreating into cultural isolationism. Actually, scratch that. It's more about free will. It's the sovereign right of liberated African intellectuals to study, deconstruct, and claim ownership over any global tradition on their own autonomous terms, as equal global partners.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. If the classroom was originally built as a cage, who currently holds the key to your education? The historical structures of control we've talked about run incredibly deep, for sure. But as we've seen, the grassroots resistance is just as vibrant. Understanding this dynamic radically shifts how we view educational policy, funding, and even the very languages we speak. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.